This is Chapter 21, Section 4, Absolute Rulers of Russia. We're going to get into talking about Russia. The previous lesson, we were talking about the nations that surrounded France, and before that, we talked about French's empire with Louis XIV. So now we're going to talk about Russia. The objectives describe the Russian state and the rule of Peter the Great. Main idea: Peter the Great made many changes in Russia to try to make it more like Western Europe, like France and Great Britain and Spain. Now, why does this matter now? Many Russians today debate whether to model themselves on the West or to focus on more traditional Russian culture. In terms of names: Ivan the Terrible, he was Russia's first Tsar. Peter the Great brought change to Russia, adopted Western ideas, technology, and culture. The boyards, these are Russians' land-owning nobles. Westernization, using Western Europe as a model for change, adopting new Western ideas, technology, and culture. And a Tsar, meaning Tsar means Russian's emperor. So the Tsar is in head of the nation. They're in charge of the nation. It's pretty much their dictator. Ivan III of Moscow, who ruled Russia from 1462 to 1505, accomplished several things. First, he conquered much of the territory around Moscow. Second, he liberated Russia from the Mongols. Third, he began to centralize the Russian government. Ivan III succeeded by his son Vasily, who ruled for 28 years. Man, that's a long time. Vasily continued his father's work of adding territory to the Russian state. He also increased the power of the central government. This trend continued under his son Ivan IV, who would become an absolute ruler, just like Louis XIV. Ivan IV, called Ivan the Terrible, came to throne in 1533 when he was only 3 years old, so this guy was younger than Louis XIV. His young life was disrupted by struggles for power among Russia's land-owning nobles, known as boyards. The boyards fought to control young Ivan. When he was 16, Ivan seized power and had himself crowned Tsar. This title meant Caesar, and Ivan was the first Russian ruler to use it officially. He also married the beautiful Anastasia, related to the old boyar family of the Romanovs. The years from 1547 to 1560 were called Ivan's good period. He won great victories, added lands to Russia, gave Russia a code of laws, and ruled justly. Ivan's bad period began in 1560 after Anastasia died. Accusing the boyards of poisoning his wife, Ivan turned against them. He recognized his own police force, whose chief duty was to hunt down and murder people Ivan considered traitors. The members of this police force dressed in black and rode black horses. Using these secret police, Ivan executed many boyards, their families, and the peasants who worked on their land. Dang, so he was killing a bunch of people. Thousands of people died. Ivan seized the boyards' estates and gave them to a new class of nobles who had to remain loyal to him or they're going to lose their land. Eventually, Ivan committed an act that was both personally a tragedy and a national disaster. In 1581, during a violent quarrel, he killed his oldest son and heir to the throne. When Ivan died 3 years later, only his weak second son was left to rule. So him and his oldest son were disputing about something, and Ivan took his cane, probably metal, some type of strong force, and he cracked his son over the head with it. And he bled out. He killed him. I guess he didn't mean to kill him, but I mean, it definitely pouring blood out of his head. It killed him. Big mistake. Ivan's son proved to be physically and mentally incapable of ruling, so this is his other son, his weak one. After he died without an heir, Russia experienced a period of turmoil known as the Time of Trouble. The boyars struggled for power, and the heirs of Caesar died under mysterious conditions. Several impostors tried to claim the throne. So you had some people faking to be related to this guy. Finally, in 1613, representatives of many Russian cities met to choose the next Tsar. Their choice was Michael Romanov, grandnephew of Ivan the Terrible's wife Anastasia. Thus began the Romanov dynasty, which ruled Russia for 300 years from 1613 to 1917. 1917 is when the Russian Revolution was going to happen, but we will get into that later. All right, Russian life before Peter the Great. There were only three social classes: the boyards, the church, and the serfs. Russia was still in the Middle Ages with touches of Muslim culture added in. There was very, very little interaction with the rest of Europe or even the world. And going back to the three-class system, the boyards, these guys were Russian nobles. Most of them called themselves princes, and from the 10th and 17th centuries, they were the real rulers of Russia. The position in society that they held was based on the service your family did for the Tsar or by owning land. They had pretty much no checks on their own local power, so they could pretty much do whatever they want. You could change your loyalty to different princes depending on what they would give you in return. They dressed like Arabs and never trimmed their beards. They had a separate society for women. Women were often never seen, or they were left alone, or you never even heard from them. They lived in their own feudal estates with their own armies and self-sufficient economies. So these boyards seemed to be pretty powerful. And they had little interest to the outside world. Now the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, was one of the oldest Christian religions. It did not recognize the Pope or the Catholic Church. They practiced the Christian religion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. They urged people not to be corrupted by outside influences, and they urged serfs, who were the other lower class, to remain loyal without questioning the boyards, so the upper class. Life is suffering, but heaven will be your reward. That is what the church's motto was. Man, it should be the opposite, right? Maybe not the opposite, but life should be rewarding too. All right, the serfs, at the time of Peter the Great, they made up 95% of the population. So if we all lived in Russia during this time, most likely we would all be serfs. They were essentially slaves, bound to the land, bound to the nobility. They had absolutely no say about anything in their lives. Yeah, if you were a serf, your life would be suffering. All right, so over all three of these levels, the Tsar, or the Emperor of Russia, would see over all three of these guys: the boyards, the church, and the serfs. And he had absolute power. But few czars had been powerful enough to make the boyards and the church obey him. So sometimes the boyards and the church would not obey the czar, but the serfs always did. All right, Peter the Great comes to power. Over time, the Romanovs restored order to Russia. They strengthened the government by passing a law code and putting down a revolt. They paved the way for an absolute rule, and this guy was going to be called Peter the First. He was a czar. First, Peter shared the throne with his half-brother. However, in 1696, Peter became the sole ruler of Russia. He is known to history as Peter the Great because he was one of Russia's greatest reformers, so he made a lot of changes in Russia. He also continued to trend the increasing power of the Tsar. And we will get into more of Peter's accomplishments in our next lesson. So hopefully you learned something today. Peace out.